Hello, friends and fellow citizens of Systemic Formulas and Alimentum Labs. I'm excited for this one. This one has been in the making for a little bit here. We've been sending out notifications, emails, and stuff like that so you guys could get involved in this. So thank you for joining us today for the Blu Poo Challenge. This call is an excellent opportunity for health practitioners to gain an understanding of our new Blu Poo tool. It's very intuitive, and by attending, you'll be equipped with the knowledge to guide your patients effectively and help them achieve some better digestive health. I mean, that's kind of our thing. You know, we do the microbiome, so using this tool is really useful. Additionally, when you promote this challenge to your patients, you can significantly enhance their engagement and proactive management of their health. So we can get the two together, which normally doesn't happen too often in our industry, right? It almost feels like two separate worlds, right? The patient and the right. So this is an opportunity to get us all together in the same room and you know, look at our gut health in a way that's never really been looked at before with what we have offered here. Please just stay until the end and you'll find out all the next steps for the challenge. But now that's the introduction, and Shayne is all ready to go, and he's got a lot of cool information for you guys. So I'm going to hand it on over to him.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. And it is very exciting to be here. And one of the reasons that we decided to take on this challenge is because we really want to introduce the concept of the microbiota and the importance it has beyond gut health. Clearly, many people will embrace the idea of fixing their gut, but many people it's certainly an underrepresented value of how it fixes the entire body, well beyond the gut, all the way to longevity, right? It even plays a role in longevity. Therefore, we want to spend a little time on a simple tool. And in my mind, the exciting bit of this tool is not only does it allow us to manage the idea of our gut and the microbiota as part of that, it also allows us to communicate, in an exciting, tangible way, a visible way of understanding how the gut is behaving. The gut is truly a remarkable organ, and most of us can appreciate it in the moments that it's misbehaving. We all have experienced diarrhea, bloating, cramping, and certainly when we've gotten an infection and we're incredibly sick, whether it be, bacterial or otherwise, allergenic responses. When our gut isn't happy, we're very unhappy. So it's a really amazing organ that we want to understand. And coming at this from the angle of what we call intestinal transit time. Now, intestinal transit time, let me give you a quick overview of that. That is the time it takes for a food that you're ingesting to transit from your mouth all the way to the toilet. That's what we call, that's the entire GI intestinal time. And we're going to break it down into stomach, small intestine, and large intestine briefly, but that is the entire transit time. And believe it or not, one of the exciting things about this is by understanding the intestinal transit time, we will gain insights into how our GI is behaving, how our digestive hormones are utilized and or impacting the function of our gut. And then finally, it really gives us an amazing tool to understand the complexity or the problematic nature of our microbiota. In fact, often people ask me, I understand this idea of microbiome. I understand that we have these inhabitants, these trillions of invisible microorganisms in our gut. In fact, they're everywhere on us and in us, but the gut is a really important concentration of these organisms. Is there any way to simply get an idea of how well that microbiota is behaving? Or is it a healthy microbiota or an unhealthy microbiota? And after today, my goal is to use this test because it's a very effective test to give you that insight. A healthy microbiota is correlated very closely to your intestinal transit time. So that's one of the main reasons why we're doing this, so that we can get an insight into that microbiota. So without belaboring that point, because we're going to get into more intestinal transit data, let's get over and look at our objectives. So the objectives of this are, of course, intestinal function and dysfunction. This is important. It's a starting point, and understanding really the power of our intestinal tract. What does the intestinal transit time tell us? I've given you some hints there. How can transit time predict health outcomes? This is where we're starting to get deeper into the physiology, the biochemistry, a lot of the mechanisms that we can start looking at more detail of our microbiota, as well as our own physiology and our own intestinal cells, for example. Idiopathic symptoms. These are important because when it comes to the gut, so often, whether you're a patient to a clinician or a clinician that is experiencing gut problems, idiopathic means we don't know the source of the problem. Why are we all of a sudden constipated? Where is this chronic diarrhea coming from? Because I otherwise don't remember being exposed to something that would cause these symptoms, or anywhere in that gradient of symptoms that we might experience, we may or may not know the source of these or the underlying cause. And that's the idea of idiopathic in that regard. So, and then we want to measure transit time. So this is where we get down to actionable items where we can take our knowledge and the experience that we can gain from understanding transit time and apply it to yourself, your patients, your family, and so on. So we're going to get down into that actionable item, and then finally discuss the transit time microbiota and what a healthy GI tract looks like, and what are the solutions to go from where we are to where we need to be. And I can say fairly confidently that we work a lot on our physiology, right? We make great dietary choices. We try to be active. We try to create positive social structures. We, outdoors experience, dietary choices, activity, reducing the exposure to toxins, and so on. These are all very conscious decisions to improve our overall health. But what I can tell you is over the last 5 decades, probably closer to 7 decades, it's been all of these choices that we and our parents and grandparents made as a collective to simplify our lives, to sterilize our lives, to minimize our exposure to things. This has had really some important and powerful effects on our microbiota. And we need to look at this more closely, because the idea of transit time, and let's relate that to more clinical languaging like constipation, diarrhea, infrequent bowel movements, or too frequent of bowel movements changing regularity, or even bowel movements that are varying colors. And all of these clinical outputs of our bowels are telling us something. And that's where we really want to focus our attention on this particular challenge. So moving on to the journey, this is, I thought it was important to take a step back and really elaborate on the functionality of our gut. And it's a brilliant set of choreographed movements where I think it's because it's not something that we're conscientiously thinking about, or we're not conscious about what goes on after we take a bite of food and swallow it. The amount of work and the number of movements that have to take place to effectively digest the food, extract the nutrients, feed the microbiota, trigger the hormonal satiation or hunger, the balances of which nutrients do we need, which nutrients do we need to dump to waste, when does all of our waste stream byproducts of our cellular metabolism get dumped into that gut, and then we want to eliminate those along with any of the leftover remnants of food. This is a very complex system, and for the most part, we're not aware of it. It happens without very much effort, very little effort on our conscious behalf. Therefore, it's a really brilliant subconscious phenomenon that we have to respect it. And that respect for what's happening there can transform how we feel for the long haul, right? We can get to a place where it doesn't surprisingly manifest pain or discomfort and challenge us over and over again. Let's take the journey real quickly. We begin by eating some food. It enters the stomach where the vast majority of us digest. That's where the massive digestion happens. Of course, we know we produce enzymes, we produce hydrochloric acid. We want to break down all these larger particles into really small ones. As it enters the small intestine, it's broken down further. We're dealing with pancreatic enzymes at this moment, and we want to break that down into really small molecules like amino acids, vitamins, minerals, fatty acids. What am I missing? Carbohydrates, sugars, and other carbs. We want to get them smaller. And all of those critical nutrients need to be absorbed during the small intestine transit. That's what it's designed for. It also holds a smaller population of microbial inhabitants. And the reason for that is, again, is very beautifully designed, where we don't want microbes to compete with our nutrients. So we don't want these microbes stealing or robbing these macronutrients or vitamins and minerals and other essential elements. Amino acids, another example. We don't want those being robbed by these microbes. We want them to be absorbed in the small intestine. So in general, we want to keep the populations of our microbes under control in our small intestine. A great example of that, which relates to this story today, is going to be the concept of SIBO, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth. And each of those has serious consequences. And really what that means, without getting into those in more detail, that stands for the organisms growing at too high a populations in the small intestine. Can lead to the IBS, IBD, just inflammatory bowel diseases in general. And those can be, of course, if they're left unchecked, they can really cause greater inflammation, more systemic issues, and we all know where that heads. And that's a different talk than today. However, I wanted to be clear that that's why your small intestine has a smaller population of microbes, because we need to capture those nutrients. Anything we can't capture then enters the colon, where the vast majority of the gut microbiome resides. And it's these really amazing ecological communities that then break down all of the remaining food stuff. And likely if you're eating a fiber-rich diet, a lot of plant-based or even some animal-based materials, that's all going to get broken down in what we loosely refer to as a fermentable concept, where the microbes are now chewing up this food and releasing small molecules into our system that have numerous benefits throughout the body. Every tissue benefits from that microbial output from the colon. Now, the caveat is, if your microbes are not in a eubiotic state, meaning a really wonderful, balanced, healthy bug state, then it's something we call dysbiosis. And those organisms can then metabolize these same foods or foods that we shouldn't be eating and we know better, into what we call toxic metabolites or disruptive metabolites or inflammatory metabolites. So the microbes can work completely against us, or they can work completely for us. They are miniature little manufacturing factories in our colon. And when that happens, it can impact a local, a proximal, or a distal regions of our body. So proximally, it can influence the immune system, right? So that's part of my next bullet point here, is that the gut is a vulnerable organ to dysbiosis, pathogens of all kinds and sizes. And what they do is they create an issue with our immune system, because they're now present and living. They can influence the way our valves are opening and closing, because we have a valve between the stomach and the esophagus, the stomach and the small intestine, the large intestine, and the sphincter. And so each one of these valves creates a different ecological environment, pH, the number of receptors we have, the types of neuroenteric relationships between the vagal nerve and the brain. So there's a whole bunch of communication going on in each of these stages, and they can be disrupted by, of course, a dysbiotic microbiome. And then finally, it sets the tone for the health of the rest of the body. When the gut is a wreck, simply put, the entire body can become a wreck relatively quickly. And also with chronic low-level dysbiosis, it could take years before it manifests into something that you notice symptomatically. And now you're really scrambling to reverse this problem. You're scrambling to understand why these more distal effects are coming from the gut. Let's fix the gut. And of course, that's the goal for today. Let's not allow this to go on in our patients, in our family, in our friends. We need to start this journey now to fix all these things. So a happy gut, happy life, without question. So there's a number of things that can impact gut health. I'm not going to go over many of those, but we understand that our emotional status, our toxic environment, our food, our dietary choices, clearly, our activity levels, our age, our weight, or our metabolic status can really impact how our gut health behaves. And there is a lot of research lacking some of these looks at, for example, transit time or stool quality, bowel movement frequency. It's just becoming a more accepted conversation, both in the scientific community, the clinical community, and even amongst people, right? It's not something you generally walk around talking about until after today. You're going to spend a lot of time talking about Blu Poo, thinking about it. For the most part, it's really cute when babies are learning how to poop. And, those of you that have had children, it's something we're always concerned about. In fact, it's very critical to manage the transit time and the stool quality in an infant. And then we forget about it once we're no longer pooping in a diaper and looking at it all the time. But it's just as critical. It never loses its importance, even though we don't like to talk about it. So we're going to change that idea now. And despite the prevailing, the options that we have to turn this around, oftentimes your clients will turn to the laxatives, or they'll turn to some pharmaceutical remedy that acts like a laxative. And propylene glycol, by the way, is one of the most highly prescribed. These are not things we want to be doing to stimulate transit time or bowel movement quality. These are really masking and forcing the movement of the food through our body. But in the meantime, they're impacting our ability to absorb nutrients, get rid of waste, feed the microbiota. We're really pushing ourselves backwards by just trying to improve a constipation or a diarrhea outcome. And so it's important that not only are we talking about it more, but we're looking at real solutions to approach this problem that is otherwise not talked about very often. And one of the publications I looked at regarding the new looks that people are having on transit time, bowel movement quality, and of course, the use of laxatives in the population, that a number of what we call, surveys that they went out there and looked at people that clearly have GI issues. So over 30% of the people surveyed didn't really want to go to the doctor for their constipation or their diarrhea, just expecting that, if they push through it, it's going to go away. Because they just didn't see it as a severe enough issue, or they didn't really like talking about it or dealing with it, clinically, for example. So it is an underrepresented subject, and we got to turn that around. And it really is overlooked. I mean, everything going on inside of our gut, we don't sense it. We don't really know what's going on unless you're a very interoceptive person. And there's trillions of microbes that are benefiting from our choices, or conversely, they're being damaged by our choices. So it's a really important subject to do. What's the choreography? I mentioned that early on, where we want to understand the brilliance of our GI tract. I mean, there's no question, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a deeper respect for the entire GI tract. from beginning to end, and especially end, because that's the one that we don't really pay attention to. But there's a choreographed scenario that really needs to be highlighted. I mean, I went through, chewing food, digesting food, absorbing nutrients, feeding bugs. But in the meantime, if you look at this slide, you're going to see over 13 hormones. One of them will pop right out to most of you because it's been in the news lately. It's been in the media, as well as probably circling around in your own family, and we call that GLP-1. This has been known about for a very long time, but now it's popular because of what, essentially a weight loss target. But truly, it has a deeper importance in managing our GI wellness model, or the GI behavior. We know that we have the CCK, which is the cholecystokinin, secretin, GIP, motilin. And just by thinking about the names, because I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, it's unnecessary, and you guys will get a copy of these slides. But for example, secretin. This is a hormone. As the food's transiting, it tells the pancreas to secrete the enzymes to break down the larger molecules of food into smaller ones so they can be absorbed more readily. Motilin, that one, I mean, it should be pretty self-explanatory, where if you're not producing a motile contractile GI tract, and what that means is, as you imagine, as your food's traveling, all those smooth muscles are contracting to keep that food moving. And that movement, if you lock up that movement, you can imagine and you've, I'm sure, seen patients, and we all know someone that has stalled their movement, and that can back up quickly, and then it dehydrates, becomes hard, and to the point where it can become impacted. And that becomes very, very scary clinically. But motilin is the enzyme that's responsible for a lot of that movement. And then we know about insulin, glucagon, pancreatic polypeptides, which also stimulates motility, because remember, motility starts from swallowing all the way through releasing your defecation into the toilet. So we need motility all the way along, and we have a very long GI tract. For men, it's around 30 feet long, women slightly longer. This is so important when you're thinking about moving something down a tube that is really compacted into our abdominal cavity. These, it's going back and forth. It's a very winded up tube, and that movement, it's got to keep that stuff moving. So these hormones are important. And the reason I wanted to take a minute to point them out is because the influence on this hormonal system has, up until recently, been a physiological biochemical process that we knew our body was taking care of based on dietary choices and other factors, against exogenous factors from, our lifestyle. Our genetics is an endogenous factor. It does play a role. So understanding your genetics is important here. The amount of infections that you might have had. There's a lot of things that we can't go over now, but just know that there's the internal impact, external impact that triggers these hormones. And then, of course, oftentimes when you're taking a drug, a hormonal drug for this, like GLP-1, you're directly impacting one of these systems by taking those types of drugs. So let's look at what happens on the two extreme ends of this. So an overzealous gut would be what we'd consider diarrhea. That is, the transit time is extremely rapid. Food is going through us very quickly. And in fact, it's going through us so quickly that it's very watery and liquid, doesn't have much body by the time it goes in. I mean, maybe no body. It can just be almost a soup coming out. And chronic diarrhea is defined as more than 3 watery stools per day. And it's actually at a decent prevalence. And the symptoms can be painful. Again, there's the IBS-D, there's anxiety that can be impacted. But from a microbial standpoint, we now know that the diarrhea person, the person that has diarrhea microbially, so their microbiota, they tend to have a lower micro alpha diversity. So the microbiota has a lower alpha diversity. And let me simplify that for you. Alpha diversity means abundance of microbes. There are fewer abundances in people with chronic diarrhea than there are in people that are either normal. And as it turns out, on my next slide, you'll see that having constipation raises alpha diversity. So it becomes this conversation that we'll have in a second about where is diversity optimal. And then the causes, we know that diet can create it. Lifestyle, obesity tends to push more diarrhea into these obese patients. Medications can cause it. Exposure to pathogens can certainly cause it. We know that. Inflammation, brain gut axis. Diarrhea can actually be triggered by things like trauma, the head trauma or spinal trauma. These, anytime you influence the brain gut axis by either through the central nervous system or the vagal nerve, you can trigger diarrhea, and oftentimes even throwing food up at that point. Now, the opposite end of this spectrum is what we call the stalled gut or constipation. Now, constipation is a chronic idiopathic constipation, is a functional gastrointestinal disorder that leads to psychological and physiological issues. Diarrhea is something that it's not always as unknown as constipation can be. Constipation has more influences along that path with hormones and all of the other types of issues that we'll talk about in a second, whereas diarrhea tends to arise more acutely, but then resolve more acutely, as opposed to chronic constipation, which can persist for a much longer. Diarrhea going on for very long becomes super dangerous because you're dehydrating as well. And typically it gets addressed much more rapidly. Similar prevalences, and it's actually costing billions annually because of can disrupt work, it can disrupt performance, it becomes a drug-related intervention for many people. So there are many medicines and it creates a lot of challenges there. So it is costing the healthcare system quite a bit. And really, when you move it back to a wellness model, it can be addressed so much more effectively. Similar to the other one, you've got pain. It's like less than 3 hard bowel movements a week, different types of irritable bowel syndrome systems. Again, it can affect your cognitive through the gut-brain axis. It has a higher micro alpha diversity. So our microbiota alpha diversity goes up. And it's also associated with the production of metabolites from this diversity that are neurotoxic, hepatotoxic, and nephrotoxic. That, in other words, liver, kidney, brain. And these metabolites, as they persist through someone that goes through bouts of chronic constipation, they lead to, in many times, as one of the causal agents behind chronic diseases. So this is an important hallmark that we really are just beginning to learn. These are coming out of studies really recently, and I've cited a lot of those on these slides for you. This is a new look because, again, instead of looking at the human part of this, the genetic cellular piece that is ours, our physiology, we're incorporating the microbiota here. And that microbiota, even though alpha diversity in the majority of situations should lead to a more diverse and a healthier microbiota, we need to look at something called beta diversity. Who actually is in those populations? I'll give you an example. You might have a really diverse garden full of weeds, or a really diverse garden full of amazing edible plants. And you would qualify those gardens very differently. The one that's got a lot of alpha diversity, but it's full of weeds, that's not a productive alpha diversity. And that's what happens in these constipated, more diverse guts. And they produce more toxins from the food we're eating. That's an important concept I want to get over. Now that we've really laid the groundwork for the concept of how our microbiota, our endocrine system impact the gut axis, we can start to look at some of the real data that has teased this out and helped us understand these impacts. Because from a physiological standpoint, we know which organs produce, which parts of the GI tract produce those 13 hormones that I showed you before. Might even be a little bit more. But we now know that the diet and the microbiota influence how these hormones are produced, when, and how they're received, how the receptors of these hormones are behaving throughout the GI tract. So the microbiota plays a critical role in hormone homeostasis. And that's what this little graphic is all about. So we have diet that influences the microbiota. The microbiota then produces all these short chain fatty acids, secondary bile acids, and a lot of other metabolites that can either positively or negatively affect GLP-1, PYY, GIP, serotonin, and CCK. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. It actually influences many more, which directly, by the way, influence glucose metabolism, insulin sensitivity, fat storage, feeding, and satiety. So this is a direct link between not simply our diet and our physiology, but now the microbiota and our physiology. So it's a new, again, I'm saying it over and over again, but I'm reminding you that this microbiota is a new organ that is found its place in our body, and we need to consider it as we consider all these other challenges that we're facing. So that little slide right there is very telling in terms of the more we manage a good microbiota, the more we're going to be able to manage all of the other physiological concerns we have for our body. It's critical in maintaining the neuroendocrine or the enteroendocrine process, which is great for us from an outcome standpoint that we all want. We want to thrive. We want to be healthy. We want to be active and growing, and all of those fun things we want to maintain with this. So now, taking a step back from all of that education, we're going to start to talk about what are the practical ways in which we want to measure our gut performance. So let's first look at timelines. So on average, there's been a number of people, Tim Spector, a great researcher, highly respected, they did a study where they looked at timelines. There's been a few other groups around the country, around the world actually, looking at timelines of transit. Over the years, it's been tried over and over again with various tools, but now this, what we call a blue dye, in our case, blue spirulina and indigo from an indigo plant, as long as you can track it, it gives you a great insight into that transit time. And we'll get into more of that later. But as other people have done this work, there's a lot of varying numbers, of course, as you can imagine. And they're all impacted by lifestyle, metabolism, all various things, diet they're using. So when you take, thousands of people and you measure their transit time, you're going to get a lot of data, but you can, of course, statistically measure the mean or the averages, et cetera. So the numbers next to the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine icons represent the transit time ranges that we see. So the gastric is 1 to 2.5 hours on average. The small intestine is 2 to 7 hours. And we just take the mean of that if we want to know that center number. And the large intestine, believe it or not, ranged between 4 and 134 hours. This is a huge discrepancy, which really speaks to the challenges that we face to turn this process around, because there is no reason why someone should have a 4-hour transit time in their colon and someone else have a 134-hour transit time. These are so disparate. We need to bring this together through the techniques we're talking about today, because ideally, and I didn't put that on here, and I did. There's one of the upper ideal ranges down at the bottom, which stands for the whole gastrointestinal transit time is 28 hours. I would even take that a step further and say that the ideal transit time for the healthiest microbiota, where you're managing both the microbe and the physiology of our own GI tract, would be between 18 and 24 hours. And then you could create a small window around that for people that are still working through it. But in your own practice, when you do this challenge with us, you're going to see people that come back with varying times. And this is why we're doing this, because there's so many conflicting times. We have to bring back some of this. Now, throughout the month for women, it could change subtly. There's other examples of why it can change, but if we can identify those, that isn't actually a problem. We just know the ebbs and flows or the circadian rhythms of transit times as they relate to our environment, what we're doing, what we're eating, and so on, right? It becomes a predictable phenomenon, not a surprise and a crisis in the end. So the gut microbe transit axis, this is a new axis I've just named now transit axis, because the transit time is now intimately tied to the microbial populations, as I've clearly outlined. So this graphic just shows you that there's been some players identified in some of this research being done. For example, we know that diet will feed the GI, but it also becomes a physiological or biochemical impact on the gut. Our gut senses the kind of diet we eat. Our stomach knows when we're eating high fiber diet versus a lot of protein versus something simple like sugar, and it digests very rapidly. Our stomach senses the type of food we're eating. In fact, the entire GI tract has these really amazing neuropods that sense food all the way along the GI tract. So that's the human side of our GI digestive tract. And then there's the microbial side. And what I want to point out is there are players that seem to show up when we are eating certain diets that impact microbial metabolites. So there's metabolites we want, and there's toxic metabolites we don't. And things like Prevotella, Prausnitzi, Bacteroides, Ruminococcus, Methanobrevibacter, Akkermansia, and Allotypes, we need to balance those, because even if we know they're all supposed to be there to create diversity, if something like Akkermansia gets too high, that's going to start impacting this balance or this homeostatic dietary transit. And these can be measured and balanced now. And we're going to begin with transit time. So transit time health. This I just want to show you is slow transit time constipation shows significant improvement in hormones, neurotensin, motilin. In addition, these there are polymorphisms genetically. I just briefly mentioned that genetically we are predisposed to some level of hormone impacts based on your parents, your grandparents, right, your ancestry. So as part of the question, and I didn't put this at the end, but I'm telling you now to make a note, as part of our gathering data throughout the challenge, throw ancestral or inherited notes on there that, hey, I've noticed that I have these bouts of constipation, but you know what? My mom had it too, or so did my dad. It's worth note until we actually do some genetic testing on people. You want to note that as part of our data collection. Symptoms and vagal tone in type 1 diabetes correlate with gut transit time. So we know now through genetic and microbial gut-brain axes, we can see that vagal tone changes in diabetic type 1 people as it relates to transit times. And that's a bidirectional. So type 1 impacts the gut microbiota through the vagal tone, and vice versa. As we move a microbiota into a more unhealthy state, the vagal tone changes, and it creates these gut-brain disconnects that then contribute to the progression of these issues. So it's really there just to show you that this bidirectional can be, you can either start with a healthy gut and do something to create an unhealthy gut, which is then going to trigger metabolic outcomes like the insulin resistance, for example. And that goes other direction as well. Now, there's another study that showed there's a marked increase in the orocacal transit time, and that's just another word of the entire transit time in patients with neurological decline. And many of you clinicians that have worked with, dementia patients, Parkinson's, autistic, any of these people, they tend to, and it's statistically quite high, that this neurological issue contributes to gastrointestinal or transit time impacts. It usually slows down, and they have a higher incidence of constipation. And again, that's bidirectional. And the numbers are pretty clear. I didn't put them on here, but there's many studies you can look at in that regard. And the microbiota changes equivalently. Now, this slide, I really wanted this for you to, I'm not going to go through it in detail. There's a lot to digest here. Don't mind the pun. but I wanted this to be a reference for many of you for later because it tells a very big story about the detail going into this. So for example, if we start at the top, you can see transit time, and these are ranges that various labs have determined from the gastrointestinal transit time to the small intestinal transit time to the 3 colonic intestinal times. And so you'd have to sum those CTTs up to get the total, the colonic intestinal transit time. That aside, if we look at the middle part of this, so as transit time increases, you can see that the fecal water content decreases. And we all know that as we become more constipated, we lose water in the colon back to the body. It disrupts our electrolyte system, and our stools get harder and harder and harder, and it becomes more and more dangerous. But more importantly, if we look down into the middle of this slide, for example, we can see that with more rapid transit times and the microbial saccharolysis. So what that means is this is the microbial population that's really enjoying complex carbohydrates, mostly found in plants, for example. As we move this scale from short transit time to longer, we start to shift the population of microbes to what we call proteolytic microbes. And they start chewing up more proteins, and it shifts what they're making. Instead of making a lot of short chain fatty acids and other substrates, or excuse me, products, we shift to branched chains, fatty acids, and so on. So it just changes this dynamic. And oftentimes, the longer that persists, the more and more these metabolites become dangerous. And then, of course, I mentioned the diversity and composition changes. Enough said there. This is I wanted to show this because it's a publication that came out just recently that showed that similar to transit time, there's something called bowel movement frequency. And that's how many times you go to the bathroom a day. We don't necessarily know how long it's been in there, but if you have a daily bowel movement, you have a bowel movement every 1 day, 3 day, every 4 days, and so on. That's called bowel movement frequency. And it impacts this particular publication where they looked at I think 1,400 or more people. They show that the less frequent you have bowel movements, the higher risk you are getting inflammation, heart health, liver function. You're impacting these critical functions the more and more you move to infrequent bowel movements. And then they dug deeper into doing blood metabolite analysis, where they drew blood from all these people. And as these bowel movements got spread out, people that were having bowel movements once a week, twice a week, just really infrequent bowel movements, looking at the metabolites coming from the microbes in the gut with all of that constipated stool sitting there, they showed that a lot of the microbial derived metabolites were becoming toxic. And then they even went so far as to look at the kidney function based on some of these metabolites, because these are known nephrotoxic compounds. So they know they were hurting the kidney. So they looked at the blood levels and of course then looked at people that already had chronic kidney disease and found the correlation. So it clearly has severe impact. So we need to get a handle on this early, because the bowel movement, the frequency, transit time start to change our microbes. Our microbes start to work against us to this extent that it's contributing to these very serious consequences with liver health, neurological health, kidney health, and more, skin health even. So what's the pathology? This is really kind of a breakdown of that slide before. So we know that we're identifying groups of microbes that are showing up in higher levels in constipation versus diarrhea, and vice versa. And in a normal group, which I didn't put here, we would find a much more balanced representation of these diversity, both alpha and beta. And I'll spend time in the future digging more into the microbiota and what it really means to have a healthy diversity, not just a diversity. So let's look at the ways to evaluate this as clinicians. So now we're moving this from our understanding the importance, the clinical impact of the bowel movements, the GI tract, the hormonal impacts, the microbial impacts, to what can we do about it? How can we turn all this information into an evaluator or actionable position? And then I'm going to call this status evaluation. So as you, or as a clinician looking at a patient, We want to understand, is there evidence of constipation, or are we in a medium slow? So it may not be a daily bowel movement, or, 2 bowel movements every 2 day or day and a half and so on, versus all the way down to diarrhea, where they're having 3 or 4 liquidy bowel movements a day. So let's analyze and look at those immediately from this, and categorize them. And I've created a category for you. We've got constipation, which is a transit time level, medium high, diarrhea. And then we've got bowel movement frequency. How often is it happening? And then, of course, stool type. And I'll give you a chart for that. And then we want to look at the environment. We want to know, what kind of diet are they on? Are they subscribing to the wellness model? Are they looking at getting as many whole foods, organic? Are they avoiding toxins as much as possible? How's their home life? Where's their mental status, their psychological status? I'm not advocating becoming a psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm saying that simply understanding their feelings around bowel movements, their feelings around food and other anxieties will give you insights, because you can retrain your bowel movements, not only just through food and creating a healthy microbiome, but mentally addressing or consciously addressing your bowel movements and being happy about it, taking time out of your day to go, hey, I want to really happen. And then start to create a routine. Every morning between 10 and 10:05, I want to sit down and have a bowel movement. And your brain will start to communicate to your bowels and allow that to happen more efficiently and effectively. So there is a training concept because of that vagal nerve. It's brilliant. So that is part of this journey. Are there any underlying infections or injuries? Because those can clearly implicate, or injuries and or infections can, I guess, interfere with this process. Now that you mentioned that, are they on any drugs? Look at some of the side effects of drugs, because they can absolutely impact our bowel movement status. So this becomes the tools that you look at, and we'll get more into this. So more actionable. So by using bowel movement tools and understanding all the exogenous factors that we just went over, and I'll try to cover more in a minute, and then the symptomology, we can formulate a wellness strategy, a strategy that we're really excited about, because this is where you put all of your passion and knowledge into play with your clients, as well as your own life. So let's choose our diets with intent, because the key to ending constipation, diarrhea, and this is an overstatement, mind you, and I just want to have fun with it, but it's by treating the colon and the microbiome like the intelligent organs they are, because they truly are intelligent. And let's do things with intent. Let's choose our diet with intent. Let's understand and have conscious awareness of our bowel movements. Let's have lifestyle adjustments to start to mitigate this. And they don't have to be expensive, by the way. We want to support the microbiota with pro and prebiotics, because we have done measurable damage to our microbiome. And one of our jobs here is to repair that. And that's what we've spent the last decade creating that. And then we repeat it. We don't give up on it. It's going to be an ebb and flow, and we want to stay constant, because one of the things that we know about this healthy microbiome and healthy GI is being consistent. It loves consistency. So what are we going to do? Let's now talk about the tool of analyzing our bowel movements. And we call it the Blu Poo pill. It's really a gut transit time tracker. There's an image of it. You may have heard about me or heard me talk about it before, but we take 2 blue pill capsules, preferably with food. And let me tell you why, because we want to engage this tracking through the food that we're eating in the moment. If you take it on an empty stomach, it'll actually give you a transit time. But when you're fasting, or if you take that on an empty stomach, it tends to shorten the transit time. It transits a little bit more quickly in that scenario. So take it with food preferably, but if they can't, that's okay if we get the other version of it. And in fact, if you want to have fun with this, take a patient and track people that are in a ketogenic state or in a vegetarian or vegan state, and do different comparisons, because we want to bring all this back as a challenge and start having discussions, looking at how to make improvements to the people in your clinics, the people in your world, and all of us sharing this information in this challenge. And we need to understand that ketogenic diet's going to have a different impact than a vegetarian diet, than an intermittent fasting diet, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if you find someone in your practice that just comes in new to you and they're on the processed food diet, hey, we need to know what that data looks like. So yeah, get them on the Blu Poo and let's see what that looks like, because no one's going to honestly admit they're on a processed food diet. So if you get one, grab them. We watch for that stool to show up in the privy, which is the toilet, and we record the time. That elapsed time is what we consider the transit time. The time you ate the pill to the time you see the blue poop in the toilet, that's transit time. And then we want to analyze the stool for type, which I'll show you in a second. And then we want to keep great records. And again, I'll give you an example of that in a second. But I want to point out one little thing here that I forgot to put in my record keeping. But there, over the course of the different times we've tried this, there's been a few people that have approached me saying, okay, I got my transit time. Here's what it is. What do we think? But one or two out of, let's say, 30 came to me and said, I think I noticed that there was some blue dye in my urine. Now that should not happen. There is no way that this blue-green algae or spirulina and or the indigo from the plant should make it through the intestinal wall. There's no evidence of that. And of all the times we've did it, there's only a few people that have reported that. So it's anecdotal. But while doing this challenge, I wanted to alert you all to the fact that if you get someone, ask them that question, or as you're doing this, at least expose the idea that to watch their urine as well. Because if there is any going through the urine, I have a hypothesis to what's going on. I'm going to leave it at that until we get into our next series of conversations and so on. And you can think about what you think the answer is too. Now, Bristol stool chart. This is straightforward. You've probably seen it. It turns out that the science is much better for transit time than the stool. However, there is still value here. And where that value comes in is by looking at the stool between the Blu Poo transits, or even after they've done the Blu Poo, having them turn around and look into the toilet and kind of get an idea and maybe record it. And do it yourself for a little while, because you'll see patterns, or you'll see something that you can question. That needs to be recorded in this challenge, because there's color and there's types, and we want to record those. So record keeping, we want to keep the transit time. We want to get the stool type. We want to have the bowel movement frequency. How many times a day they're going. Definitely catalog the types of diet these people are on, whether it be the carnivore or the vegetarian, omnivore, intermittent fasting, and so on. That Blu Poo, we've talked about that. And then you must join us on our platforms, on all the platforms. We've got Dr. Shayne Morris, we've got Alimentum and Systemic. And of course, in the Facebook group, which I'll get to right now. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm jumping back real quick. We'll get back to that. There is some fun charts in Eastern medicine, and I've always looked at these over the years, and they're fascinating, but they are somewhat telling. Don't underestimate the power of the Asian history of medicine, the non-allopathic, where they have used stool as a marker for so many brilliant things. In fact, that the traditional Chinese medicine practitioners have records of looking at our microbiota before they even knew there was a microbiota. They were doing fecal oral transplants thousands of years before we even considered it. So there's so much here that's really fun. And I didn't want to leave this talk without giving you a real quick of the green stool, yellow stool, orange stool. This is a really fun thing to look at. And again, it's a conversation starter, and there is some telling information here. So I didn't want to leave that out because it's really exciting. Now back to the end of my talk, because we're getting there. Blu Poo Challenge begins August 14th. So order your packets soon, allowing time for you to distribute them to your patients. We realize that many of you may not see them on a daily basis, and so you need time to get these packets out to them. And then join us live in the Facebook group at 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time to review challenge details. Once we start the challenge, we're then going to be getting together more frequently to discuss results. And that'll be beginning on August 28th, where we're going to start the next Zoom Live after we've reviewed results. And where are we going to be looking at results? On the Systemic Facebook group. I know it's practitioner only, so make sure your pages are giving you the feedback, and then you can post. You can keep it anonymous. We have no need to not keep it anonymous. That'd be great, and then no one's nervous about it. The patient, I mean. And then we can have these conversations and start looking at the variety of things we're seeing, transit times, and what are the solutions? What are the protocols that we want to start implementing based on what we're seeing throughout the patient population? Because I know we're going to learn some amazing things, and we want to keep that, catalog it, because that is going to help us drive forward this first challenge and solution with protocols. That it's going to be super exciting. You've got to join us. We will be in the next Zoom Live to discuss these results. So we'll do some statistics. Once they start showing up on the Facebook feed, we will start digging into there and doing some of the, I'll gather the scientists, the geneticists. We'll start looking at some stats on these things and present them back to you and go through some of them and even apply some of the existing knowledge in the science that I just glossed over more today. We'll dig into that a little bit more as we're digesting, so to speak, the data. So also join us every Wednesday for updates on Instagram, and that'll be me or someone else. We're going to have fun with this, and we just want to engage you. So please, all of you, sign up for the social medias, get onto these Facebook groups, because it's going to be exciting every step of the way. Once this challenge is going, we're going to be introducing new things, genetic things, more microbiota, more ingredients, some of the organisms that we have that you've not even heard of, and what they can do for us, some of the new compounds in the genetic formulas, and so on and so forth. That's going to be happening more frequently. So yeah, join us. And after that, I wanted to thank everybody for joining me. Super exciting to have you here, and I'll pan it back over to Matt.
Make sure, guys, to grab your Blu Poo. Just call the 1-800 number. If you know your rep, whoever your rep is, we'll get those out to you, and just get ready for August 14th. That'll be our kickoff, and get in that Facebook group, because I know a lot of you guys have become friends through there, and just don't be afraid to talk about it, because we actually monitor that group. I can see that group too. So if you guys have questions about this Blu Poo, throw them in there too, and we'll answer them. We'll also answer all the questions that we saw that was put into the Q&A in here. And then we will be sending an email out with all of your information that Shayne talked about that has to do with like the start dates and the Facebook group and ordering the Blu Poo, the August 28th date, all that kind of stuff. We're going to send updates through emails. Okay. So thanks for coming. We wouldn't be able to do this without you guys. I mean, we wouldn't even be on this call if we didn't have you guys supporting us. So we really do appreciate you guys coming here. And like I said last time, we'll answer your questions, and then just tune in for the next one, because we'll be doing these quite frequently. So we'll talk soon, guys. Okay. Take care.
Thanks.